Welcome to this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. My name is James Williams, and today I am joined by Alex Dono, who is the host of the Locked On Canes podcast, also hosts Locked On ACC, covering all things Miami football. And Alex, how's life in South Beach right now? Is there a lot of optimism with this team right now?
Yeah, there is. I think a lot of Miami fans, rightfully so, have a little bit of a wait and see or see it to believe it type of approach, which makes sense because, Miami, they have some similarities to, over the past several years to like the Texas Longhorns, where there's a lot of hype. Now, Texas finally lived up to their hype last year, which makes people wonder if this could be the year when Miami lives up to their hype. But there definitely has been a lot of that Kool-Aid going around this coming off season, but folks will need to see it to believe it.
I think that is the exact comparison that I was just going to bring up because last year, everybody in my Big 12 circles I was talking to were talking about Texas. And everyone was kind of like, I got to believe it to see it. And I was just kind of looking at the roster. I'm like, if you look at their roster up and down, they are like the top tier of the conference. So I think this team could win the conference, potentially go to a playoff. And I think that is the same exact formula that you are seeing this year with Miami, especially on the offensive and defensive lines. Like the defensive line, you guys got Ruben Bain, who is one of the best guys in the country on the defensive side of the ball. Offensive line, you got a few guys returning, got a few transfers coming in. And I think kind of what is probably going to be the biggest factor, you guys actually living up to your hype, because I was reading a Phil Seals preview for you guys. He said 5 of his 9 sets had Miami winning double-digit games this year. So I think that is a more optimistic side for you guys. But I think the biggest factor for you guys succeeding this year is the quarterback position, because last year it was a little bit up and down. There was some really good moments, but then Tyler Van Dyke battled some injuries. Emory Williams comes in, it looks like you guys might beat Florida State. Then he has the very gruesome elbow arm injury, and now this year you guys are kind of dipping back into the transfer portal. You got Cam Ward coming in, and I think the biggest concerns with him are the turnovers, and can he run this Miami offense efficiently? What are you hearing about Cam Ward right now?
He's looked very good. I've been, I think, to every media viewing of practice. Not all of them are open to the media. I think I've been to every single one of them going back to the spring. And Ward has been very impressive. Yeah, I'd watched him quite a bit playing games at Washington State. It's always different to get a look at a player in person. And one of the things you notice about Ward in person that obviously doesn't come through on game film, his leadership. I mean, quarterbacks always should be leaders. There's something a little different, James, that Cam Ward does that I've been told is not very common at the quarterback position. Is he talks a lot of trash in practice, which is not like a lot of times they'll have like the receivers and the DBs that jaw at each other and offensive and defensive linemen. But Ward is talking, friendly brotherhood type of stuff. It can get a little nasty though. He talks trash after every play, and it fires up players on both sides of the ball. I think one of the factors that made Miami attractive to Ward, I had a chance to speak with him about this a few weeks back at the ACC media days, is they were like very open to kind of allow Ward to really be a leader and to kind of implement his own style and even collaborate on the playbook and things he's comfortable with running. And I think that was really important to Ward because he not only, and I gave you a window to kind of his competitiveness, so he wants to win as a team, but for him, like, he's also trying to improve his NFL draft stock. I mean, that's the reason why, because he was temporarily declared for the draft. He never made that final step that would have made it official. He decided to undeclare, I guess you would say, and come to Miami instead. And I know one of the things he was looking for was to get on a team where he could really kind of put his fingerprint and feel like he can improve his draft stock. And you talk about Miami's talent. I mean, specifically on the offensive side of the football, they've got what looks like it should be one of the better offensive lines in the country, certainly one of the best units in the ACC. They're going to have to kind of figure out their balance between passing and running because they've got talented play. And, we know Mario Cristobal loves to establish a ground game, but then you also have a really talented returning wide receiver core with Xavier Restrepo back. He was over 1,000 yards last season. Jacoby George was an 800-plus yard receiver last year, and Sam Brown, who transferred in from Houston, was an 800-plus yard guy in the Big 12 last year. They've got some weapons at tight ends. I think Ward decided this was the type of offense he can theoretically thrive in.
Talk about the wide receivers. It looks like it's probably the best trio in the ACC. If it's not, it's probably like two or three. And I'm just kind of looking at this Miami team. You talked about the running game. That was a huge jump that you guys had last year. I think you guys had like a 60 or 70-yard jump from 22 to 23 in rushing yards per game. And then you have Cam Ward coming in, who is a dual threat type of running back. Is this a thing where it's kind of going to be like whatever happens with the offense, like we're going to do what's successful, or is this going to be a team that is like going to try to establish things on the ground and through the line of scrimmage, or is it just going to be kind of an air raid thing and utilizing Cam Ward's passing ability with all of these weapons that he has at his disposal?
Yeah, I wonder the same thing because Miami seems to be with the talent that they have, not only throwing the football, but the talent that they have at running back with Mark Fletcher back from last year and Damian Martinez, who was a 1,200-yard back who transferred over from Oregon State. They seem to have the luxury that they can kind of dictate the tone of the game, but then they also have the luxury of, well, whatever the defense is trying to take away, they can attack them in the opposite way. So I don't know. I know they've got an offensive coordinator in Shannon Dawson. You mentioned air raid. Dawson comes from that air raid coaching tree, so he's obviously gonna be tempted to call plays that throw it all around the yard. But then you also have the ability to wear teams down because I think that's the big thing when you have Miami's got a pair of running backs who are 225, 230 plus. Mark Fletcher is around 225. Damian Martinez is, I think he told me he's 229 right now, will be around 230 in the season. Like those are the types of backs that can wear defenses down. So I think we're not really going to know until they open up the season against Florida. And then once they do, maybe we'll figure out, do they want to be a run first team or is it going to be more of a 50-50? It was pretty much 50-50 last season, but with different personnel. So I wonder about that. But, you asked about the wide receiver core. I think as far as what past production, they've got the most established receiving core in the ACC. I'm not sleeping on some of the other cores out there like SMU. That's a new team in the conference. They've got some talented receivers there. But in terms of what Miami
Mhm.
brings back, they bring back three receivers who had over 800 yards last year in Sam Brown, Xavier Restrepo, and Jacoby George. And also, Miami's got another receiver who's heading into his third year. I think he's going to be a redshirt sophomore, Isaiah Horton, who has had one of the best off seasons of anybody with the way he's developed in spring and to fall camp. So I think they really feel like they have four guys who are going to be competing for three starting spots. And then there's some talented young receivers as well who can add some sparks. So yeah, this is, I mean, all in all, it's probably all this is on paper, of course, as we know. This is the Miami thing we do. We get very excited, but on paper, this is probably the most talented Miami offense I've covered in at least a decade.
We are being very optimistic here for like the first, like, what are we talking about? 8 minutes here. I do want to mention that you mentioned the Florida game. That is a probably one of the toughest tests that Miami's going to have this entire season, and that is the opening week going to the Swamp in Gainesville. And that is a place that has tripped up many a foe before. We saw Utah 2 years ago go in there week one, lose, but then they came back, won the Pac 12 championship. We saw, I believe it was last year, or maybe even the year before, Tennessee comes in. Tennessee, I don't think has won there in like almost like 2 decades, which like Tennessee's had like up and down, teams for those past 2 decades too. But the fact that they haven't been able to have much success there either just kind of tells you how much struggles you can have in the Swamp. Is there a lot of history with Miami going to the Swamp and like playing against Florida? Like what kind of like success rate do you guys typically have when you make that trip? I know you don't play like every year against
Right.
Florida, but what is the success rate of like going to the Swamp and playing against a Florida team, even if they're maybe not the best?
It's very mixed. This used to be up until I think 1987. This used to be like a regular yearly rivalry between Miami and Florida. Since '87, it's just been an occasional thing. Usually, even when they're at the Swamp, usually the more talented team ends up winning that game, and maybe Miami is that, but I don't know if they're it's a really tough place to play. I mean, I can think of an example. This is going way back when Miami, this was their first national championship team in 1983. they lost their opening game at the Swamp, and then they ended up running the table and winning a national title. But that was what 41 years ago. But the last few times I can remember Miami playing there, they lost there in 2008. But Florida had a better team that year. Miami was punching above their weight.
Mhm.
That was Urban Meyer years there. Miami did win there in 2002, which was, a team that really should have won the national championship, but they ended up falling against Ohio State, but clearly had the better team. The last time Miami and Florida played each other was in 2019. It was in Orlando, which was like technically a neutral site, but it's closer to Gainesville, a lot more Gator
Mhm.
fans there. But I mean, I'm just thinking about recent examples of playing there. Usually the more talented team wins that game, whether it's home or away. But your point is well taken. That's a very difficult place to play. Rabid fan base. They're going to get up for a game against Miami. And also, like, okay, both of these teams, they practice in Florida, so they're used to the heat, but they call that place the Swamp for a reason. And they made this a 3:30 p.m. game. 3:30 p.m. game there in August.
Oh boy.
It's going to be absolutely sweltering. And I think it might even be hotter in Gainesville that day than it is in Miami, because at least in Miami they get some sea breeze, which kind of cools things down a little bit. Whereas in Gainesville, it's landlocked, and it's gonna be nasty there. So I mean, I would, usually people say that home field advantage in college football is worth about 3 points. It might be worth four in that building. It's a tough place to play, no doubt.
You have a little bit of the culture clash there too, where you have Miami that's like a city team to a degree, and then you have like Gainesville, Florida, that is a college town. So definitely a lot of different dynamics going on in that game. I'm looking at the rest of the schedule here for you guys, and it is a favorable schedule this year. That's kind of the thing when you're going through a lot of these previews. It's a lot of it is like with the Big 12. I was talking about like a few days ago. It's like, hey, who has like the best road here? Who has the easiest schedule? Same thing with teams like the Big Ten. It's like, oh, Rutgers has like a really high win total this year. It's like, I wonder why they're not playing necessarily the best competition, or it's like not even necessarily who you are playing, but who you are not playing. And I'm looking at Miami here, and it looks like there's a good chance if you guys get rolling early, you could be favored in a decent chunk of these games. Is there any sort of trap games that you could potentially see? I have a few that I have written down here, but is there any potential trap games where it's like maybe Miami's double-digit point favorites, and they're either going to a place or somebody's coming to Coral Gables, and there's a little bit of a scare for you guys?
Yeah, one that I'm circling, which is a non-conference game on a team that's been ascending over at least last year. I think they were terrible 2 years ago, but last year they were pretty good, and that's USF. Miami goes to Tampa to play them. They almost caught Alabama off guard in their building last year. So I don't sleep on USF. Alex Golesh, their coach, seems to be building that program nicely. So that's definitely one for me early in the year. And then you've got some of the usual suspects on there. Georgia Tech is one. Like I think, and Georgia Tech, honestly, that's a good football team. So
Yeah.
that shouldn't even really be considered a trap team, because Georgia Tech to me should be top half of the ACC this year. They should be like one of the 8 or 9 top teams in the conference. Miami goes to Atlanta to play them. We all remember what happened to Miami against Georgia Tech last year. So hopefully the Hurricanes have revenge on their minds. I'm very intrigued by the home game against Duke, because former Miami head coach, who's not, very popular among Hurricanes fans, Manny Diaz, is now the head coach at Duke. So I'm sure he'll get a very warm reception at Hard Rock Stadium when the Blue Devils come to town. But yeah, and then they're probably the two toughest games, I would say. Well, the three toughest games, because Florida is obviously up there. Not trap games, of course, but games that are these are the ones that Miami may be underdogs in. They actually are favored against Florida by about 2.5 points, but Miami should be road or home underdogs against Florida State. I would imagine that it's going to depend on how the teams start, obviously, but I could see Florida State maybe being 3.5, 4 point favorites by the time a line comes out there, even playing at Hard Rock Stadium. And the road game against Louisville is going to be a difficult one. And then another trap game that pops into my head is Miami's got to go all the way across the country to Cal.
That's the one I was thinking.
Yeah, and it's like, traveling, and this is going to become, I guess, a normal thing now that Cal and Stanford are in the ACC, but to travel that far for a regular season game, it rarely happens. Like the last time Miami traveled that far or farther for a regular season game was in 2000 when Miami went out to face the Washington Huskies and they lost that game, and it ultimately cost them a trip to the national championship game, on a team that was good, but Miami should have beaten that team. But travel across the country, you can kind of throw a lot of that other stuff out the window. So I think that's another massive trap game on the schedule.
Coach Wilcox at Cal too always is a guy that has his teams playing up to their competition. They would scare Oregon, scare Washington, scare some of those USC teams, scare Utah a few times. So that is always a tough team to play. And all of the Pac-12 friends that you might be getting into your conference here soon with Stanford, Cal, they'll definitely tell you that. Thank you for watching this clip from the Sports Detective Podcast Show. If you like what you saw here today, please hit that like button and hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. That is the best thing that you can do to support this show, and it costs you absolutely $0, and it is the best thing that you can do to help this show grow. And feel free to check out the rest of the Sports Detective Podcast channel page, because you might find some other videos that you like, including that video right there on your screen right now. Thank you for watching. Talk to you next time.